Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are presenting here at the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice, and our presentation today is over mission congruent responses to climate justice at all levels. And to give you a brief overview, we will be introducing ourselves once we begin to present each of our sections. Our first section is with Dr. Ann Ozar, who will be presenting on the philosophical and historical obstacles to action on climate change. And then I will be presenting on the present day sustainable and conscious actions. And then following suit will be Director Nick McCreary of our Sustainability Office here at Creighton for future actions on universities and campuses. Okay, so Dr. Ozar.
Yes, thank you. I'm Dr. Ozar. I am a moral philosopher and a teacher of environmental ethics. And so I'm going to be focusing here today on some of the philosophical and historical obstacles to action on climate change. The abstract noted that my comments would include some arguments for why we should act to end environmental degradation, but I think that it's likely not something that those of you who are attending need a lot more detail on. From the standpoint of Creighton's mission, which I'll say something about in a little bit, and really most any ethical theory, there is good reason to conclude we have some duties in relation to climate change. However, the specific reasons why we have a duty really do matter. They matter both for specifying what exactly it is we have a duty to do, and they matter because some sources of moral responsibility are better able than others to face the unique challenges to motivating action that climate change presents. And that's really what we're going to see, is that different ways of thinking about the source of moral duty are better or worse able to deal with some of these challenges. So because climate change is a collective action problem, the sort of what we might, I think, rightly call the kind of legacy of inaction, which sort of characterizes the human response to climate change over the last, say, 30 years, is often framed in terms of what's called the sort of classic problem of collective action, which is the idea that even though sort of in everybody's self-interest, if everyone acted to mitigate climate change, it's really only in the self-interest of individuals to do so if they know that everybody else is also going to do so. And in the absence of strong binding international agreements, self-interest will lead to mutual destruction. This is a pretty, you're probably familiar with, a sort of common way of thinking about what's often called the tragedy of the commons. But such portrayals of collective action from the outset as necessarily a problem generally assume that we can only ever be motivated by self-interest. And luckily, that's not the case. People can and often are in many areas of life motivated by a sense of personal moral responsibility. And indeed, massive changes in attitudes and social policy are generally only really possible through changes in our practices of accountability, of holding each other to account. Others holding us responsible, shame, and blame are actually, as it turns out, great motivators for social change. But in order to feel comfortable holding others to account, we need to be able to make sense of personal moral responsibility when it comes to climate change. And that is actually, as it turns out, very hard for us to do. So we need a sense of personal moral responsibility that's capable of supporting new practices of accountability, needed to motivate persons to choose and tell their governments and politicians that they choose to bear the burdens that are related to mitigating climate change. So I want to focus then on why it is so difficult for us, or some of the reasons why it's so difficult for us to get a sense of our personal ethical responsibility. So you hit this slide, Gabby, thank you. So one of the great challenges that a collective problem like climate change presents is that while the impact of all of us together could be world changing, the impact of one person or even one institution on the problem can seem negligible, and thus not a source of moral responsibility or a source of motivation. It's basically this idea that our action or policy really wouldn't make any difference at all. And so we're not responsible to do anything. And of course, this situation is very difficult with climate change because we have what is often talked about as the spatial and temporal dispersion of cause and effects. Climate change is the result of sort of billions of little actions that are smeared out over time and space. And that creates difficulty for us in thinking about personal responsibility. Part of that difficulty comes from the idea that harms for which we can be held responsible must be individual. And this is deeply embedded in our modern conceptions of moral responsibility. So it's not, so it is a sort of importantly historically situated way of thinking about responsibility that's very distinctive of Western modern philosophy and civilization. And it involves this sort of general idea that in morality and politics, consideration of the individual is going to reign supreme. And I'm not here talking about selfishness, I'm talking about the prioritization of the individual as a sort of locus of responsibility. And the idea termed evaluative solipsism by Christopher Coots, which is the idea that the proper basis for evaluating moral responsibility is limited to the content or the effects of an individual will. And this idea is due to what at first appears to be a pretty uncontroversial intuition regarding moral responsibility, namely that persons are responsible only for what is within their control. This is sometimes called the control condition for moral responsibility, and it's an intuition that most people simply accept as sort of obvious. However, in the modern era, our shared cultural conception of both the nature of freedom and the scope of individual control has undergone some significant changes from other earlier conceptions. And it's a well-known feature of Kantian philosophy, for example, that questions of responsibility are to be answered only by reference to the content of an agent's will. And this isn't only the case for Kant. We also see the concerns about the sort of whether or not my act would make an individual difference as determining whether I have any responsibility. That's also a problem for common utilitarian philosophies as well. So this sort of emphasis on the idea of that the proper basis for evaluating moral responsibility has to be the content or effects of an individual will leads to sort of the conclusion that neither an agent's relations with other people nor the actions of others are relevant to determining the worth of their actions. And so if we think about responsibility in this way, it would seem that responsibility for freely chosen actions can't properly be shared with others. And indeed, such actions are understood as free precisely in their independence from influence of others. And so the considerations here lead or support the assumption that any harm for which an agent may be held morally responsible must be ascribable to the agent alone, and as such, that the morality of actions are to be evaluated entirely in isolation from the consideration of what other people are doing. Given the collective causal nature of the problem of climate change, right, this assumption means that the conditions for seeing oneself as one who can be held responsible cannot be met. And the primary problem for collective action in this case is that we do not view our responsibility in light of the possibility or capacity for collective action. As a result, such action is stalled by our very common ways of rationalizing away personal responsibility. You should hit the slide. Thank you. So in addition, beyond this sort of theoretical and maybe sort of psychological ineptitude of this form of individualism when it comes to making sense of our responsibility for collective harms, there is also a further area of social and political implication for how we think about responsibility that is also stemming from what in Laudato Si Pope Francis again describes as rampant individualism, and which I see as related to a really important feature of our modern political life in the West, which is that it is characterized by an overemphasis on individual rights and entitlements, and a kind of characteristic decoupling of rights from responsibility. So in conjunction with the way of viewing the source of our moral responsibilities as coming from a notion of kind of individual contract or consent, this idea that we are sort of first and foremost sort of unsituated free choosers who then somehow choose to be social, generating certain responsibilities. That way of thinking about our freedoms and our rights lends itself to or conspires with the other rationalizations we just mentioned to sort of limit our grasp on the scope of our responsibilities. That is, by sort of limiting our moral concerns to simply not interfering with other people's entitlements. But it also conspires with a kind of purely economic conception of the value of nature to lead to environmental degradation itself. We increasingly kind of treat the environment as, in the words of Amy Wendling, temporary and expendable. We tend to recognize only our entitlements, but not prohibitions and limitations, and to treat it as if it was a commodity, the use of which has no lasting sort of consequences. So that tendency toward an increasing kind of decoupling of our rights from responsibilities reflects, according to Pope Francis, a kind of lack of appreciation for the whole and a loss of a kind of robust notion of the common good. Can you hit the slide? And that brings us to thinking through what some of the opportunities are in Jesuit education, in particular, coming from our Jesuit Catholic mission, in combating some of these deep sort of philosophical and historical roots of our kind of obstacles to collective action. And very importantly, as just noted, a sort of renewed appreciation for the idea of the common good is one of the aims of the integrating education that is central to Creighton's mission and to other Catholic missions. And that can enable us to see ourselves and our responsibilities from the standpoint of an interdependent whole, rather than isolated, self-sufficient free choosers. So in addition to the fact that the kind of moral outlook that we see coming from our mission is non-consequentialist, in the sense that even if we can't make deep impact in our individual choices, that we can make sense of being complicitous through our intentions, but even more importantly, we can come to have a sense of our impact through the lens of collective action. So the practical impact, and Gabby and Nick will say more about the practical here, but the practical impact of this shift in perspective is that personal responsibility for climate change is viewed in light of our capacity to participate in collective action. And when it's viewed in this way, the moral failing of inaction becomes clear, because the intuitive force of the control condition now bears on our collective capacities. And so conceived, it's not any one individual's capacity to prevent this harm, but our shared capacity for collective action, which ultimately explains why we are responsible and can ultimately motivate action and overcome the fragmentation of agency. So thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ozar. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabby Baker, and I'm a senior here at Creighton. I am an environmental science major and a social advocate for justice for the environment. And today I will be presenting on present-day sustainable and environmentally conscious actions that you yourself can be a part of, but then also what our university and organizations here on campus have been doing. So at Creighton, we have been having different divestment movements within our campus, but you've probably seen that nationwide within other Jesuit organizations and universities. We have also been doing composting and recycling drives, doing energy competitions, hosting environmental justice symposiums, and even having climate strikes. So our question that is always asked is, why do movements stop slow, and how do we start them up again? Sometimes what we usually see are that people start to burn out. So those leaders that usually are the select few that have this like ultimate goal are having a hard time getting other people involved, and then start to just overexert themselves with their time, their energy, and then they burn out. So then you start to see those movements slowly wear down and like trickle out till no one else is actually working on them. And when people talk about it, they're like, oh, that was a thing once. So to make sure that doesn't happen, I will go over a few motivations in a little bit. Also, turnovers in organizations, especially at universities. Seniors and upperclassmen that hold those leadership positions don't teach and mold the future leaders of their organizations. So then you see those organizations fall, and they're not being the motivation to continue following it. Additionally, the idea kind of touched on by Dr. Ozar was this micro perspective versus the macro perspective. What can I as an individual do to impact any change on environmental justice? Like, what am I doing that actually can do a change and impart change on my university, in my community? And instead, we need to shift that idea. Additionally, you might hit roadblocks along the way with either the upper people within administration, or additionally just having difficulty with other leaders. And one of the most severe ones that I think can really impact your motivations is apathy. So apathy is defined as a lack of feeling or emotion, kind of an impassiveness. and a lack of interest or concern. Apathy is a vice, which is a bad habit or a weakness within one's character that takes away from the morals and actions that they can apply within society. It actually detracts from human flourishing, as Pope Francis points out in his encyclical Laudato Si', which through the control of one's own feelings and actions, they no longer feel like they're able to continue to act upon their own moral responsibilities or even their own wants for the future, and feel like they can just disregard the issues at hand. And we continue to see that within our world today through the use and continued harms of our planet and its well-being. Although we know about all of the harms and degradation that's occurring on the planet, it's very difficult to continue to motivate ourselves to want to act, because as just one individual, how can I make sure that global warming or climate change can be stopped or ended? Because what am I able to do? And what we actually want to show you is that there are ways in which you can shift that and ways you need to motivate yourself. But I want to talk to you a little bit about some examples here on our campus here at Creighton. So we have the divestment movement that was started a few years ago, and other Catholic universities and Jesuit universities have taken suit. So what is divestment? Divestment is the reallocation of funds from one's endowment. So universities usually have millions of dollars worth of money into an endowment, which then they invest in certain aspects of their portfolio to what they see will give them the greatest return. What we are asking is that they divest from fossil fuel use and then reinvest in renewable energy and resources. The want or need to act has always been a question, especially since we've known about the environmental harms for decades. But then now, since we are reaching this tipping point where it's almost improbable that we can actually come back and live in harmony with our Earth, we actually need to act. And that's why a lot of our generation and a lot of organizations are saying, no, we need to act now. But you might face little roadblocks with people within the board of your university or just with different opinions than yourself. And that's just when you need to sit down, talk to them, and see what you can do or what you need to do as students, but then also just as an organization to move forward. Additionally, our campus and environmental activists were beginning to question what our campus has every day and what we can do to make it more sustainable and environmentally conscious. And that is when we enacted in our student government to use reusable grab-and-go containers, which would promote less waste on our campus, but then also would be an example of what sustainability looks like in your everyday life. Due to COVID and concerns of whether or not that would be transmitted and a harm to students, we decided to enact Composting Initiative, which then focuses on making sure that our food waste is able to be composted in a sustainable way, but then also all of the packaging that our food came in was able to compost and was not going to just be left for hundreds of years, not decomposing at all. So what I want to end on today is ways in which you can motivate yourself and your group. So you need to expand the reach of your initiatives. One thing that we found within our divestment movement was that sometimes you just get stuck on one thing, and like consistently pushing it makes it very difficult for you to move forward. So what you need to do is continue to have that motivation for that topic, but then you can expand your reach with getting more people involved if you incorporate other sustainability initiatives or other people's interests, which brings me to my second point. Bring in new perspectives and fresh ideas. You might have some fantastic ideas, and I know you do, but you definitely need to take into account some other ideas that you hadn't thought of, because your organization as a whole can benefit from the other people's ideas within it. Additionally, recruit your future leaders, especially on university campuses. You need to make sure that once you leave, that it can be continued and sustained so that the movement continues and that you're actually motivating those around you. And additionally, I ask you to find ways to advocate and serve. Don't only focus on the advocacy work if it's something that isn't really for you. So if it, instead of just typing up legislation within your student university governments is not really for you, find a way in which you can use your hands-on, be a hands-on server to other people, like our Composting Initiative and some other ones that Nick will touch on.
Great, yeah. Well, my name's Nick McCreary. I work in the Office of Sustainability Programs at Creighton University. I've been with Creighton for about 6 months now, 7 months since March, so I'm the newbie here on this presentation team. And I'm going to talk to you today about how we are combating collective action roadblocks within our residence hall recycling project. And these techniques could also be applied to the composting program that Gabby just mentioned. So what I mean by combating collective action roadblocks in the residence hall recycling is really pushing back on the idea that individual student actions of recycling within the residence hall don't have much of an impact, so why do them at all? Combating the idea that may be in students' heads, right? And so I'm using the residence hall recycling program as an example because it is happening right now, and it is serving as a pilot for what our future waste hauling strategy could look like. And it's being driven by the idea of how we can combat the collective action problem. So in waste diversion literature, there's about 5 to 7 different ways that researchers talk about for increasing waste diversion or to increase recycling rates or composting rates, and they can be broken into 2 different areas. And one is called the antecedent, which is any sort of action or program or initiative that takes place prior to the act of waste diversion. So prior to someone putting something into a recycling bin. So the first one, and I'm going to cover 2 of these in depth, but I'll just go over them quickly. Prompting is what you normally see as flyers or messaging. Commitment interventions is one that I'm going to talk about in depth, but it's more about getting an individual or an organization to make a commitment to doing something. Normative influence is the other one that I'm going to talk in depth about, is about changing the culture. Goal setting is what it sounds like, setting a goal of we want to divert this much. So that by setting that goal, it usually leads to higher diversion rates. Removing barriers is typically referred to as like providing more access to recycling or composting infrastructure. So rather than having a recycle bin at the base of the residence hall, having one on each floor, that would be removing the barriers to recycling. And then the other family of methods for increasing waste diversion is consequence. So this is stuff you do post the action of actually recycling or composting. And they could be either rewards or feedbacks. And rewards are obvious. It's something we are doing for the competition, but something we want to move away from because rewards are not sustainable in a financial sense. And then feedback is a really interesting one that sort of pits individuals against others in sort of a competition. A lot of utility companies use this by sharing your neighbor's utility usage with you to sort of try and put you in competition with your neighbor. And it has shown to reduce energy usage, and it also has shown to reduce or to increase recycling rates. And these are all a bunch of studies that have led me to this little chart, and we will share that in some way with you at the end. So Gabby, could you go to the next slide? So one of the big ones I want to talk about is commitment interventions. And let me give a really quick, brief summary of the program that we are in the process of implementing and running through right now. Creighton made the decision to stop picking up recycling at the university level due to COVID, due to safety concerns for our custodial staff. And our custodial staff has been given a larger workload with all the sanitation processes that need to go on. So recycling has been suspended for this semester. And so students have been coming to me, and I'm sure to others, essentially pushing for how can we do something to help our custodial staff out and divert some waste. And one way we came up with was a recycling competition between the different residence halls. And we designed this recycling competition around those different methods for increasing waste diversion and at the same time overcoming a collective action roadblock. And so one of the big points that we wanted to stress was we wanted students to be committed before we put any resources from my office into the competition. And those resources being for those bags that you see, for all the protective supplies that students will need to safely collect recycling. And the commitments that the students made were, they actually had to write out a 1 to 2 page action plan of how are you going to collect recycling from your residence hall. And you can see in that picture in the background, that's one of our residence halls. So these students put together a plan, not as a part of a class, just because they were interested in this and outlining to me how they were going to do it. That is a commitment, especially for a student to do work above and beyond what they're being asked. That shows that they're interested, they've put in the work, they're committed. More research shows that recycling rates also increase when commitments are being measured and then those results are being projected. So in this picture, you can see the backpack of one of my student workers. His name is Bryce, and he actually measures all of the recycling waste that gets collected. And that is that measurement where we're measuring each hall, and then we're posting the weights of each hall collects publicly, so that there is that commitment. Students put effort in to be a part of this, and now their efforts are being publicly displayed, which is sort of a socializing norm of, oh man, I didn't recycle as much as my neighbor hall, now I want to do more. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And then the other big method that we're using to increase recycling, and I think this is the true way to overcome collective action roadblocks, at least within a residence hall or waste diversion, is through what the research calls normative influence, but I like to just call it cultural change. And these words on the screen here are my definitions, and there is research to back it, but this is kind of how I view it. So we wanted the competition to be organic. And by organic, I mean, students came up with this idea and students created it and students own it. And that's exactly what it was. We had students collecting recycling door to door on their own before I even knew about it. And so that signaled to me, this is something that students truly want to do. It was an organic process. It's in the opposite of that would be me going to the residence hall and be like, all right, this is what we're doing, now you have to do it. That does not create a culture that is useful for overcoming collective actions. Another way that we made this program organic is through those commitments. Students are coming up with their own plans for their own halls. So we're not just giving them the impression that they own this project, they actually do own this project because they are coming up with the way to implement it. Accessible. What I mean by accessible is, to put it bluntly, students' lives are different than those of professional staff. And professional staff need to be cognizant of that and appreciate that difference. And so we are making this recycling competition as accessible to students as possible. So for example, you can see this car here. The students are actually taking the recycling to a local recycling center. And I told them in their plans, you pick the time you do that. If it doesn't work for you to do it at 8 a.m., which works best for me, but that probably isn't going to work best for a bunch of freshmen, no offense, that's fine. Make it accessible to the people that you want to change the culture of. Additionally, students have so much going on with classes, with COVID, with everything that's going on in their lives. We want to make them own this project, but we don't want them to have to do all the boring boundary and bureaucratic work. So we sort of set up a structure where I went around, received approvals and purchased all the supplies and set up the rules so that students could function within a framework that allowed them to be successful while still putting in work, but not work that would be viewed as monotonous and maybe would make someone drop out of the competition. And additionally, we're making sure that no students have to pay for anything because that is not accessible to all students. Another big one is operated by students. And what I mean by that is rather than professional staff coming in and collecting the waste, students are actually collecting their own waste within their own residence hall. And this, I think, is the biggest key in overcoming the collective action roadblock for three reasons. One, students who are doing the tasks actually see the results of their work. So these students are walking around with these large paper bags that you can see in that car, and they can literally see as those bags fill up that they are making a difference physically in their hands. And then the same goes when they measure it and they put it in the car. They can see, I think at this time we collected 90 pounds of recycling. That's visual, and it's stimulating to see your work actually materialize literally into something. So fellow students also see the work that the leadership teams who are actually collecting the recycling, they see that work happening, and that applies some societal pressure of, hey, these students are doing the work of taking out my waste. Maybe I should be a part of that. Or giving students permission to step outside of their comfort zone and be like, recycling is really important to me, but I'm a little shy, or I'm a little embarrassed to go this, but now look, these students are doing it, I'm just gonna jump on board. And you'd be amazed by how many students actually have emailed me being like, hey, can I join this too? I never knew that this was something we could do. And then finally, by allowing students to operate the program, we are receiving feedback that is completely genuine and the most useful feedback possible. And I mean that because we want to get the input from students who we're trying to get to recycle more. So input from those students is exactly who we need it from, not from outside organizations. And then finally, hands-on, this is important because when you are actually seeing what waste is being produced, whether it's someone giving the students the waste or the students collecting the waste, that is registering in your mind, oh man, this is what I'm producing, this is what I'm responsible for, which in the United States, we generally push waste to the back of the house, throw it away, never forget about it, and it's never part of our life. By making students actually deal with their waste, they're intuitively just learning, oh, maybe I should reduce some of this. Recycling's great, but this is a lot of water bottles. I can probably just get a reusable one. And finally, I'd like to just end with, there's some spillover benefits to having programs like this. For instance, students are getting real world project management experience. They had to create a plan. Most of their plans didn't work, so they had to adjust on the fly. And as every professional knows, that happens pretty much every time you make a plan. So it's good that the students are learning it now in a low pressure situation. And they are starting to realize that implementing sustainability improvements isn't just like throwing a solar panel on a roof. There is actually layers of bureaucracy. There is tedious steps, and it's hard work. And getting students to realize that now, I think, is going to be really helpful in the long run. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for joining us on our session here today. Please feel free to reach out to any of us with our contact information here. We'd love to hear from you, or if you're even having any of these difficulties with motivation in your own organizations, or just want to hear more about what we're doing, we'd love to talk to you, or even just set up another Zoom. So feel free to reach out. Thank you all so much. Bye. I don't know how to stop recording.